Before we begin, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps bring more soothing stories your way. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Mr. Harold Stevens believed in discipline. His classroom was no place for idle fantasies, and he made that clear from the moment his students walked in. A stern man in his early 50s, his angular features and piercing eyes made him a figure of quiet intimidation. He had little patience for anything that deviated from the rigid structure he imposed. Mathematics was to him a realm of order, a world where imagination had no place. On a warm morning in 1990, the class was halfway through a lesson on quadratic equations when his gaze landed on Elon Musk. The boy sat at the back of the room, his wiry frame slouched slightly over his desk. His pen wasn't moving across the worksheet in front of him. Instead, it hovered over a separate sheet of paper, filled with intricate sketches and equations far beyond the day's assignment. "Mr. Musk," Stevens barked, slamming his pointer stick on the desk for emphasis. Elon startled, quickly covering his work. The other students turned to watch, their faces a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Musk was known for his odd silences and peculiar interests, making him a frequent target for both bullies and the teacher's scorn. "What is so important that you think you're excused from participating in my class?" Stevens demanded, his voice heavy with irritation. Elon hesitated, his pale face flushing. Slowly, he uncovered the page. On it were designs of a strange machine, something that looked like a cross between a rocket and a futuristic car. Equations ran down the margins, accompanied by notes scribbled in the cramped, hurried handwriting of someone who didn't want their thoughts to escape. "I was just working on an idea," Elon said quietly, his voice steady but soft. Stevens snatched the page from his desk and held it up for the rest of the class to see. The students giggled, whispering among themselves. "An idea," Stevens repeated mockingly. "It looks like a child's drawing. What, pray tell, does this have to do with mathematics?" Elon's eyes flicked to the page, then back to Stevens. "I think numbers are more interesting when they can solve problems," he said, barely above a whisper. The remark landed poorly. Stevens raised his eyebrows, then laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that filled the room. "Solve problems? And what problems are you planning to solve, boy? The mysteries of the universe? Or maybe just how to keep from failing this class?" A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Elon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his desk. "Let me give you a piece of advice," Stevens continued, leaning in as if to emphasize his point. "You might think you're smart, but people like you need to stick to what's realistic. You're not going to save the world. If you're lucky, you'll get a job fixing other people's problems. If they let you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Musk's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed something, a flicker of something too raw to name. He didn't respond, and Stevens took his silence as submission. "Now put that nonsense away and focus on the task at hand. Unless you'd like to spend the rest of the day in detention?" Stevens turned his attention back to the board, where he resumed his lecture. As the other students returned to their work, Musk quietly folded the paper and slipped it into his backpack. He stared at the blank worksheet in front of him, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His mind, however, wasn't on quadratic equations anymore. Instead, it was racing with the quiet determination to prove Stevens wrong, not through words but through action. In that moment, Elon decided something fundamental about his life. He wouldn't let the small-minded opinions of others dictate what he could achieve. And as Stevens droned on at the front of the room, oblivious to the fire he'd inadvertently ignited, Musk sat in silence, his dreams burning brighter than ever. Elon sat in the garage long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. The small, cluttered space was his refuge, a sanctuary where he could tinker without fear of mockery or judgment. On the wooden workbench in front of him, a model rocket took shape, cobbled together from old tin cans and salvaged electronics. His sketches, filled with impossible ideas, lay scattered around him. He wasn't crying. He had stopped doing that years ago, but his hands trembled as they worked. Mr. Stevens' words from earlier in the day echoed in his mind, each one striking like a hammer on an anvil. "People like you. You'll never be anything." The sting of those remarks wasn't new. Growing up in apartheid South Africa, Elon had learned early that divisions, whether racial, social, or economic, define much of how people saw the world. Even though he wasn't directly a target of the system's racial segregation, he felt its weight in every interaction, its lessons passed down through subtle sneers and casual dismissals. Stevens wasn't the first adult to make him feel small, but he was one of the loudest. The garage door creaked open, and Mae Musk stepped in. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she carried a mug of tea in one hand. She paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of her son hunched over his work. "Elon," she called softly, her voice cutting through the hum of his thoughts. He didn't turn around. "I'm fine, Mom." She walked over and placed the tea on the edge of the workbench. "What happened today?" Elon hesitated, then picked up a screwdriver and began tightening a bolt on the rocket. "Nothing important. Mr. Stevens thinks I'm wasting my time." Mae frowned, leaning against the bench. "What did he say?" "He said I'll never be anything more than a nobody. That I should stop dreaming?" Her expression darkened, a rare flash of anger breaking through her usually calm demeanor. "Did he now?" she said, her voice low. She crouched down so she was at eye level with him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "Elon, listen to me," she said firmly. "The world is full of people who can't see beyond their own small lives. They'll try to pull you down to their level because they're afraid of what they don't understand. But that doesn't make them right." He stopped working and looked at her, his large, questioning eyes filled with uncertainty. "You're not like them," Mae continued. "You never have been. You see things differently, and that's your strength. People like Mr. Stevens might mock you now, but they'll never understand what's possible until you show them. You just have to keep going, no matter what they say." Elon nodded slowly, her words sinking in. She stood up and gestured to the rocket. "So tell me, what's this one going to do?" "It's just a model," Elon said with a hint of embarrassment. "I'm trying to make it fly higher than the last one." Mae smiled. "Higher than the last one? That sounds about right." With that, she kissed him on the top of his head and left the garage, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For a long time, he stared at the rocket, the screwdriver still in his hand. He didn't know how, but he felt a spark reignite within him, a quiet determination to push forward, no matter the obstacles. Mr. Stevens's words had hurt, but his mother's encouragement felt like a shield against the doubt. He picked up his pen and began scribbling equations in the margins of his notebook. If the world was going to dismiss him, he thought, he'd just have to prove the world wrong. By the time Elon turned 17, his dreams had outgrown the confines of his small town and the shadow of Mr. Stevens. The world around him, steeped in apartheid-era segregation and economic inequality, was a constant reminder of the limits imposed on those who dared to think differently. But Elon didn't just want to think differently. He wanted to build a different future altogether. Leaving South Africa wasn't an easy decision. It meant leaving behind familiar streets, childhood friends, and even his father, with whom he had a fraught relationship. But the pull of possibility was stronger than the weight of nostalgia. With the help of his mother, Mae, Elon secured a plane ticket to Canada. He had Canadian citizenship through her, and it became his passport to freedom. The night before his departure, Elon sat in the same garage where he'd spent countless hours building his dreams. The space looked emptier now, stripped of the sketches and prototypes he couldn't take with him. Mae found him there, staring at the bare workbench. "Are you ready?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. He nodded, though his expression was far from confident. "What if it doesn't work out?" he asked. "What if I don't make it?" Mae stepped forward, her face softening. "You'll make it, Elon. And even if you stumble, you'll get back up. You've always done that." He looked down at his hands, calloused from years of tinkering. "It feels like I'm running away." "You're not running away," Mae said firmly. "You're running towards something. There's a big difference." Her words stayed with him as he boarded the plane the next morning, clutching a single bag filled with clothes, books, and a few precious sketches. As the aircraft soared into the sky, Elon stared out the window, watching his hometown shrink into the distance. Canada was everything South Africa wasn't: open, diverse, and filled with opportunity. But it was also overwhelming. Elon enrolled at Queen's University, where he threw himself into his studies, often working late into the night to make up for gaps in his knowledge. He took odd jobs to support himself, including cleaning boiler rooms and selling computer parts. Yet despite the long hours and grueling work, Elon thrived. For the first time, he was surrounded by people who shared his interests, who saw potential in his ideas rather than ridiculing them. It wasn't long before he began dreaming even bigger. As he delved into physics and engineering, his mind returned often to the rockets he'd built in his garage back home. He began to wonder if the fantastical ideas he once doodled in notebooks might actually be possible. The doubt instilled by Mr. Stevens had never entirely disappeared, but it had become a kind of fuel, an ember that drove him to work harder, think deeper, and dream further. Years later, when he told his friends and professors about his vision for space exploration and electric cars, many of them laughed, just as Stevens had. But the laughter didn't sting the same way. By then, Elon had learned to let ridicule roll off him, to treat it as background noise. What mattered was the work, and the work, he believed, would speak for itself. As the years rolled by, Elon Musk began to make his mark on the world in ways few could have anticipated. It started with Zip2, the software company he co-founded in the mid-1990s, which provided online business directories for newspapers. The sale of Zip2 made him a multimillionaire at just 28, but it was only the beginning. Elon's restless energy drove him to tackle bigger challenges. PayPal, the online payment system he helped develop, revolutionized the way people conducted business on the internet. While others would have been content to bask in such achievements, Elon's mind was already fixed on the next frontier: space, energy, transportation. By the time Elon founded SpaceX in 2002 and Tesla Motors in 2003, the scope of his ambition had grown to global and even interplanetary dimensions. SpaceX aimed to make space exploration affordable, with dreams of colonizing Mars. Tesla sought to eliminate humanity's reliance on fossil fuels through cutting-edge electric vehicles, but success was anything but guaranteed. The early days of SpaceX and Tesla were fraught with challenges. Rockets exploded on launch pads, draining the company's finances. Tesla struggled to manufacture its first vehicles, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Through it all, Elon kept going, driven by the same determination that had sustained him through his years of ridicule. The memories of people like Mr. Stevens, who had doubted and mocked him, remained vivid. Their voices still lingered in the back of his mind, whispering, "You'll never be anything more than a nobody." It was precisely that doubt that spurred him forward. In 2008, SpaceX successfully launched its Falcon 1 rocket, the first privately developed spacecraft to reach orbit. That same year, Tesla released its first electric car, the Roadster, proving that electric vehicles could be fast, stylish, and practical. These milestones silenced many of Elon's critics, but for him, they were merely steps toward larger goals. As his companies grew, so did his public profile. Elon became a symbol of innovation and ambition, admired by some and criticized by others. His uncompromising approach often sparked controversy, but even his detractors couldn't deny the impact of his work. Meanwhile, back in South Africa, Mr. Stevens' life had settled into quiet obscurity. Retired from teaching, he spent his days playing chess at the local community center and reminiscing about his years in the classroom. He had heard of Elon Musk in passing, a billionaire entrepreneur making headlines for his bold ventures, but the name didn't resonate with him. To Stevens, Musk was just another figure in the distant world of celebrity and innovation, far removed from the small-town life he'd always known. He didn't realize that this Elon Musk was the same boy he had once dismissed so callously, the quiet dreamer with the rocket sketches in the back of his classroom. For Elon, the memory of Stevens was a distant but persistent reminder of how far he had come. He had long since stopped caring about proving Stevens, or anyone else, wrong. Instead, he was focused on proving something to himself, that no dream was too big, no ambition too impossible. It was a philosophy that had carried him from the garage in South Africa to the launch pads of SpaceX, from classrooms filled with ridicule to boardrooms filled with possibilities. Yet even as he soared to unprecedented heights, a part of him couldn't help but wonder what Stevens would think if he saw him now. In 2020, Elon Musk returned to South Africa for the first time in years. It wasn't a casual visit. His schedule rarely allowed for those. but rather an invitation to deliver a keynote speech at his former high school. The invitation had arrived months earlier, sent by a new principal eager to showcase the achievements of the school's most famous alumnus. After some consideration, Elon agreed, partly out of nostalgia and partly out of curiosity. The high school had changed in his absence. The grounds looked smaller than he remembered, the buildings weathered but still standing. Walking through the main hall, Elon couldn't help but recall the countless times he'd trudged down the same corridors, his mind brimming with ideas that had been met with indifference, or worse, derision. The auditorium was packed for his keynote. Students, teachers, alumni, and local dignitaries filled the seats, their faces alight with anticipation. As Elon stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. He spoke about innovation and perseverance, about the importance of embracing failure and ignoring naysayers. His words resonated deeply with the students, many of whom were eager to escape the constraints of their small town and chase their own dreams. Meanwhile, at the back of the auditorium, Harold Stevens sat quietly, his brow furrowed. When he'd received the invitation to attend the event, he hadn't paid much attention to the details. It was only when Elon Musk was introduced on stage that the name struck a faint chord in his memory. Could it be? Stevens muttered to himself, trying to reconcile the confident, commanding figure on stage with the scrawny boy he'd once taught. As the speech concluded and the audience erupted into applause, Stevens stayed seated, his mind racing. After the formal program ended, a meet-and-greet session began in the school's foyer. Alumni and teachers lined up to shake Musk's hand, eager to exchange a few words with the world-famous entrepreneur. Stevens lingered at the back of the crowd, unsure whether he should approach. But his curiosity, and a gnawing sense of something unresolved, finally propelled him forward. When it was his turn to meet Musk, Elon's gaze settled on him. For a moment his expression shifted, recognition flashing across his face. "Mr. Stevens," Musk said evenly, extending a hand. The words hit Stevens like a thunderbolt. He stared at Elon, his mouth slightly agape. "Elon? Musk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You were in my math class." "That's right," Elon replied, his tone neutral but unmistakably firm. "I remember it well." Stevens hesitated, his mind spinning with memories he had long buried. The boy in the back row, the doodles, the cutting remarks. I never imagined," he stammered. Elon offered a small, ironic smile. "Most people didn't." Stevens swallowed hard. The weight of his past words bore down on him, filling the silence between them. He wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but for once in his life, he was at a loss. Well, I must say, you've done extraordinary things," Stevens finally managed, his voice faltering. "Thank you," Elon said, his tone polite but distant. "I suppose I owe some of my determination to proving people like you wrong." The words landed like a hammer, and Stevens flinched, though Elon's expression remained calm. The older man opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Finally, Elon extended his hand once more, ending the exchange with a simple, "It was good seeing you again." Stevens shook his hand numbly, watching as Elon moved on to greet the next person in line. The moment was over, but the sense of reckoning it brought stayed with Stevens long after the crowd dispersed. That evening, Harold Stevens sat alone in the corner of the high school gymnasium, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The meet and greet had ended, the crowds dissipating into the cool night, but Stevens hadn't moved. His thoughts weighed too heavily for him to stand. He replayed the exchange with Elon Musk over and over in his mind, each detail sharper than the last. The firm handshake, the piercing look in Musk's eyes, the unmistakable layer of restraint in his voice. Musk hadn't berated him or humiliated him publicly. He hadn't needed to. His very presence, his staggering success, was a rebuke more powerful than any words could have been. Stevens rested his head in his hands, his pride battling with an unfamiliar sense of shame. For decades, he had prided himself on his ability to judge a student's potential. He had believed himself an expert at recognizing who would succeed and who would not. But tonight, confronted with Musk's towering achievements, Stevens saw the cracks in his arrogance. "I was wrong about him," he murmured to himself, the words bitter and foreign on his tongue. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Long night, Mr. Stevens." He looked up to see Elon Musk standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. Most of the guests had left, but Elon had lingered, perhaps sensing that something was unfinished. "Yes," Stevens replied, sitting up straighter. "I suppose it is." Elon approached and leaned against a nearby table. The room felt vast and empty around them, the only sound the faint hum of the overhead lights. "I wanted to say," Stevens began, his voice cracking slightly, "I owe you an apology." Elon tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "For what?" "For how I treated you," Stevens admitted. "For not believing in you. For mocking your ideas. I didn't see what you were capable of, and I was wrong." Elon was silent for a moment, his gaze steady. Then he said, "You weren't the only one who didn't see it. Plenty of people doubted me, mocked me. Some still do." Stevens nodded slowly. "Still, I shouldn't have been one of them. A teacher's job is to nurture potential, not crush it. I failed you in that regard, and for that, I'm deeply sorry." Elon crossed his arms, considering the apology. "It's easy to doubt someone who doesn't fit the mold," he said finally. "I've learned that people fear what they don't understand. But I also learned that their doubt doesn't define me, it defines them." Stevens winced at the words, but he nodded. "You're right, and I've spent too long letting my own narrow view of the world dictate how I see others." Elon studied the older man, his sharp gaze softening slightly. "You know," he said after a pause, "if you hadn't mocked me that day, maybe I wouldn't have worked as hard to prove you wrong. Maybe I'd have let the doubt creep in. So in a way, you helped me more than you hurt me." The admission caught Stevens off guard, and for a moment, he was speechless. "I never meant to push you in that way," he said finally, "but I'm glad, truly glad, that you succeeded." Elon nodded, his expression unreadable once again. "It's not about one person or one moment. It's about what you do with what life throws at you. I chose to turn doubt into fuel." With that, Elon extended his hand once more. Stevens took it, feeling the weight of the gesture. "Thank you, Mr. Musk," Stevens said quietly. "Take care, Mr. Stevens," Elon replied before turning and walking away. As the door closed behind Musk, Stevens sat back in his chair, staring at the empty room. The encounter had left him feeling raw, but also strangely lighter. For the first time in years, he resolved to look at the world, and the people in it, with a little more imagination. The days following the reunion lingered in Harold Stevens' mind like a haunting melody. The encounter with Elon Musk had shaken him to his core, forcing him to reevaluate not only his past but also his understanding of what it meant to be a teacher. For decades, Stevens had prided himself on his authority and his rigid expectations, believing that he could spot talent by how neatly it fit into his predefined molds. Elon's success, and the quiet strength he had shown during their exchange, shattered that illusion. Sitting in his small, tidy house, Stevens began to sift through old papers and photographs. Buried among the class rosters and curriculum plans, he found an old yearbook from the year Elon had been his student. He flipped through the pages, scanning the faces of countless students he'd once taught. When he reached Elon's photo, he paused. The boy stared back at him with an awkward smile, his eyes alight with the same curiosity and determination that now propelled rockets into the sky. Stevens ran his fingers over the image, his heart heavy with a mix of regret and admiration. He thought back to the moments he had dismissed as inconsequential, times when Elon had tried to share his ideas, only to be met with ridicule. Stevens had failed to see the brilliance in those sketches, the spark in those quiet eyes. But more than that, he had failed to nurture it. For the first time in years, Stevens wrote a letter. "Dear Elon, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I felt compelled to write. Seeing you again reminded me of the man I once was, the teacher who believed he had all the answers and judged others for not fitting into his narrow vision of success. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement of my failure to see your potential, your passion, and your brilliance. You taught me something far more valuable than any lesson I ever taught in my classroom. You taught me that greatness often comes from the places we least expect, from the students who don't always fit neatly into our expectations. I want you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished, not just for the world, but for the countless dreamers who might one day follow your example. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to learn. With deepest respect, Harold Stevens. The letter sat on Stevens' desk for weeks, never sent. Whether Elon would read it, Stevens didn't know, but writing it had been enough. It felt like the final chapter of a long overdue reckoning, a chance to let go of the weight he had carried since their encounter. In the months that followed, Stevens began to volunteer at a local youth center, tutoring students who struggled with math and science. This time, he approached his role with a humility and openness he had never known before. When a child showed him a wild idea or an unconventional solution, he didn't scoff or dismiss it. Instead, he listened, encouraged, and helped them explore it further. He never mentioned Elon Musk to his students, but in the back of his mind, the thought of that once lanky boy with his rocket sketches stayed with him. It was a reminder that the seeds of greatness often sprout in the most unlikely places, and that a teacher's job wasn't to predict the future, but to help nurture it, no matter how uncertain or unconventional it seemed. As for Elon, he continued his relentless pursuit of innovation, unaware of the small but profound transformation he had sparked in the life of his old teacher. In the grand scope of his achievements, their encounter was just a footnote, but for Stevens, it was the most important lesson of his life. In the quiet corners of his retirement, Stevens often thought about Elon's words. Doubt doesn't define me, it defines them. For Stevens, the lesson was clear. The next time he doubted someone, he would remember to doubt himself first. Thank you so much for watching this story. Your support means everything to us. If you enjoyed it and want to see more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear from you. What time are you watching this video, and where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below and let us know. It's always amazing to see how far our community reaches. And remember, every share, like, or comment helps us spread these powerful stories to more people. Thanks for being part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next one.